there, Margaret. The sun is forever visible, its broad disk just skirting the horizon and diffusing a perpetual splendor. Welcome to Bodybuilding with Victor Frankenstein. I'm Sophie Marie, and this is the show where I'm attempting to watch every single film adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I'm going to give a quick shout out to the podcast Jane Ostentations, hosted by Sasha Sienna and Jessica Law, where they do this exact same thing, except they're watching Jane Austen adaptations, and I definitely stole the concept from them. Today, we are going to be chatting about episodes 4 through 6 of the 2016 drama, The Frankenstein Chronicles. This episode is going to end the plot synopsis of season 1. If you haven't seen the show and haven't listened to the episode directly prior to this, I would say go listen to that. That will go over episodes 1 through 3. Content warnings for this episode are child murder, mutilation, STIs, sexual harassment, death, racist tropes, and harmful tropes around sex work. It's a lot, I know. This show is a little bit bonkers. So, really quick disclaimer. The last episode I feel was a bit rambly. This episode might also be a bit rambly. This show is one of the shows where watching it is difficult to then go and discuss it, mostly because you, as a viewer, are only going off of characters by their face. Their names, like there are very few characters whose names are explicit in the early episodes, or they're said in passing and not directly connected to the characters. So in this episode, I'm going to try and make names a little bit clearer with the characters that they are attached to. Now, really quick review. In episodes 1 through 3, Detective Marlett, played by Sean Bean, and several other characters in and around the British sort of London local government and medical community are trying to find who has killed and stitched together the bodies of several children which have washed up on shore. So, in the beginning of episode 4, we find Detective Marlett and his right-hand man Nightingale and the Pity, aka the grave robber that they have sort of bribed into helping them, honing in on a group of suspects. This group is a poor family who seems to be selling bodies to medical students and medical institutions for money. Marlett sets up a sting operation where the young sex worker Flora, who has been living with him and has returned after mysteriously losing her pregnancy, as bait. Before the sting, Marlett goes to the home of Lord Harvey. He is the doctor who is a little bit anti the modern surgical practices. He believes that they are cruel, and he is pro more holistic healing methods. Marlett and Lord Harvey discuss his beliefs about the murder. This scene honestly does nothing more than to confirm the suspicions that Flora had requested an abortion, and that is how she lost her pregnancy from the earlier episodes, and it adds some more details about Marlett's syphilis condition. And it forces the audience to sit through very forced and uncharismatic sexual tension between Marlett and Lord Harvey's sister. I briefly mentioned in the earlier episode that Lord Harvey's sister is the woman who believes that the murderer is sort of going against God and that the surgeons will be using poor people against their will in medical practices. So little tie-in. I only briefly mentioned her in the last episode, mostly because she has very little consequence in those early episodes, other than sort of forcing the themes of bodily autonomy and playing God onto the narrative and then disappearing. So then later, during the meeting with Billy the Pimp, who's also a character from the earlier episodes, he arrives at Marlett's home to harass and scare Flora. So these two scenes are happening simultaneously. He asks Flora if she has sold her virginity yet, which means he doesn't know of her pregnancy. And after he leaves, Nightingale arrives and has a brief fight with Flora for ending her pregnancy. He thinks it's wrong. I mentioned in the last episode, but Nightingale's immediate desire to be romantically linked to Flora, or his simply kind of weirdly overprotectiveness of Flora does make me uncomfortable, mostly because, again, there is no chemistry between them, and there's no real narrative buildup to them even knowing each other before he meets her during this investigation. There's absolutely no reason given for them to be attracted to each other other than her potentially becoming sort of a damsel in distress in the narrative in need of saving. I also found it very uncomfortable to have the only two black men in the entire show demonstrate non-consensual ownership over Flora's body and sexuality, one right after the other, like in this episode. It's clear that Nightingale feels he is protecting her, and he's definitely coded in the narrative as being a good man, but Flora's constantly bucking him and making it clear that she does not want that from him. So I just feel like that character development is odd and makes me slightly uncomfortable. Finally, towards the end of the episode, the sting finally happens, and Flora is indeed kidnapped by this murderous family from the beginning of the episode. They find that this family has been killing people for the surgery schools, but they have no connection to Billy, the pimp, who Marlett believes at this time is the killer. And they have no history of specifically killing children, and have no knowledge of the stitched children. The episode ends with a newspaper article running, calling the case the Frankenstein murders, and a drawn-out scene of Mary Shelley herself going to the home of a dead friend, where it seems the experiments of her novel may have been attempted in real life. Cut to black. We'll come to my feelings about this in the next episode. So episode 5 begins back with the character of Mary Shelley, telling a story to Detective Marlett, where she and her husband, Percy Shelley, and two of their friends, one being Lord William Chester, a London-based surgeon with a history for galvanism, which we mentioned briefly in the earlier episodes. He comes in a little bit, but he's not a major player until this episode. The three of them kill their fourth friend and attempted to bring him back to life using galvanism. They were unsuccessful, so Lord Chester makes the death look like a suicide. She believes Chester to be the killer and the stitcher of the children. Now, please note, this element of the story is completely fictional. Mary Shelley never claimed to actually have personal experience with these experiments or with the scientific elements of her novel in real life at all. Pure fabrication. I know it's a fictional show. I also just don't want anyone to get some wild ideas about Mary Shelley and her history. It's very fascinating. We'll cover it all in a different episode. Then we cut to Nightingale, who goes to the hospital to check on Flora post-kidnapping and rescue in the last episode. One of the doctors at this hospital is behaving very strangely and kicks Nightingale out. When he tells Marlett of this, Marlett realizes this doctor must be the father of Flora's child and thus her rapist. This doctor is also the cousin of Lord William Chester, friend of Mary Shelley. When confronted, the doctor confesses to assaulting Flora, but there is no law currently against this, mostly due to the fact that she is a sex worker and there are no protections for sex workers in the 1800s. During this confrontation, he says something that makes Marlett believe he may actually be the killer. He leaves with Flora and he tries to decide how to proceed. The next morning, Lord Chester finds his cousin very conveniently dead of an apparent suicide. The body is staged similarly to the way that their murdered friend from the beginning of the episode was in Mary Shelley's story. Yet again, pointing towards Lord Chester potentially being somehow acquainted with these murders and covering his tracks. During the middle section of this episode, there is a raid at a gay sex club, which leads to one of the main opponents of the Anatomy Act to being blackmailed into no longer opposing it. We briefly discussed what the Anatomy Act was in the last episode. This only kind of serves to give some background push to the narrative. The act then passes, and at the Parliament hearing, Lord Chester's cousin's apparent suicide and the murders he's now being publicly linked to is used as yet another reason that the act should pass. So these crimes will then be harder to commit. That's the sort of idea behind, we pass this act, no madman is going to be cutting up and stitching children because there will be a surgical code. Side note, Lord Harvey, who we mentioned a little bit ago, the other surgeon at play. I know everyone sounds exactly the same. Harvey's work, like I mentioned earlier, is directly threatened by the Anatomy Act because it would work to codify medical science in a way that he is against, because he uses more naturopathic healing and just wouldn't be allowed to be a practicing surgeon because he's seen as being a little bit more barbaric. In an earlier scene, his sister, who seemingly for no reason has the biggest hots for Sean Bean's character, Mr. Marlett, finally kisses Marlett. During the Parliament hearing, the two Harveys race from the building when they see that the act is about to pass, and Miss Harvey gives Marlett a dirty look. Oh no. In another unnecessary romantic twist, Nightingale and Flora ask Marlett for his blessing for their upcoming marriage. The proposal and the courtship we have not seen on screen. When was their genuine attraction established? The world may never know. The final act of episode 5 sees Marlett actually confront Mary Shelley with the potential that Lord Chester murdered his cousin to cover up the crimes Shelley accused him of at the beginning of the episode, and she refuses to go forward with her story for her and her son's safety. Then the episode kind of ends with Marlett telling Nightingale that he believes the wrong Chester has died for these crimes, and that maybe the stitched body was not actually dumped in the Thames, but it instead crawled there from its original birthing place. This episode ends with a cut to black on Nightingale's, I think, pretty, understandably confused and horrified face. Episode 6. The finale of season 1 is an absolute doozy. This episode I both love and hate. It's basically destroys all the setup from the earlier 2 episodes. None of what I just told you matters. And it brings up a lot of very interesting ideas and themes that I am hoping get covered in the following season. As I've said before, I am recording these episodes as I watch the episodes, so I don't actually know what happens in season 2 yet. I do think that this episode also brings some unnecessary cruelty to some characters, which we will discuss in a little bit. So, episode 6. Almost immediately, the Chesters, who we were led to believe are the killers, or at least one of them are the killers, are tossed right out the window. They don't matter. After Marlett's confession to Nightingale about his beliefs that the dead children were actually brought back to life, Nightingale and pretty much everyone around Marlett suddenly believes he's mad. He's absolutely bonkers. Flora immediately wants to leave his house and move in with Nightingale, but Marlett denies this, mostly because they aren't properly married yet, which to me is kind of bonkers because you're an unwed man with a young, underage sex worker living in your house, but suddenly you're worried about propriety. When he tells Nightingale and Flora this, they get into a fight, and he realizes, I don't really remember what the catalyst for him realizing it is. I think it's when Flora tells Marlett that Lord Harvey, once she had requested to have an abortion, kicked her out. This somehow triggers the knowledge in Marlett that the Chesters are not involved with these murders, but it is his original theory from episode 1 that Lord Harvey is the killer and Stitcher. He confronts Harvey, whose right-hand man has been secretly keeping Alice from episode 1 as a captive. Alice escapes and Harvey drugs Marlett. Alice does not come back. She does not matter. When Marlett awakens, he finds that he is covered in blood and Flora has been murdered in his home. Nightingale, conveniently, arrives and believes Marlett to be the murderer and that the crime was committed in a violent rage due to her wanting to leave his home. Marlett is then tried, convicted, and executed for the crime. I cannot tell you how mad I was sitting on my couch. I was having massive flashbacks to the season 1 finale of Game of Thrones and every other Sean Bean character where he dies. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. You have got, this just feels mean at this point. But a few minutes later, shocker, Marlett wakes up. He wakes up to find that Harvey has stolen his body and resurrected him by attaching his head to someone else's non-syphilitic body. So he's alive and he's cured of syphilis. Awesome. Not quite. I was actually kind of disturbed, but like in a really great way at this reveal. Not only is Harvey a murderer of children, he is resurrecting people without their consent. And to have Marlett have his memories upon awaking was such a brilliant use of the Frankenstein monster. That moment was really chilling, and I hope we get some more. There are some later moments that I do think are pretty chilling as well, which we'll discuss in a second. Later that day, Harvey shows his sister, who remember has the hots for Marlett, that her secret love, has been resurrected. She's pretty upset, as we know she's a deeply religious woman, and that night she goes to Marlett. She's obviously losing it a bit. This is the first time we see her where her hair and clothing aren't like pristine, which, obviously means she's gone a bit mad. And knowing that her brother will now never let her die and see the kingdom of heaven, she asks Marlett to begin eating again, which he's been refusing to do, so they can make Earth their kingdom. It was honestly the best bit of dialogue that she had been given in the whole show, and I actually think the most chilling line in the entire show. I think that was the moment where this real kind of existential religious horror came crashing down, only to have not been given to us for the rest of the show. The episode ends with her, Miss Harvey, marrying the other man. He's the opponent to the Anatomy Act, who we saw get blackmailed for being gay in the previous episode. They've been betrothed the whole time. I honestly don't remember his name. He's a very inconsequential character. During her wedding, Marlett attacks Lord Harvey's men and escapes the hospital that he's being held at. This gives us a delightful nod to earlier Frankenstein tales as the monster stumbles out of the seaside castle and into the world. End season 1. Overall, this first season is near incomprehensible. What's happening, but trying to parse it down into a succinct retelling has made me kind of realize that I, at times, have no idea what's happening. I know that my retelling is quite lacking due to this, and I'm hoping that it's at least semi-comprehensible in these plot synopses. I feel that it has really interesting ideas, like I brought up. It has ideas of robbing of autonomy, of what does it mean to be religious? What does heaven mean in this kind of context? That I think are more interesting in a modern retelling of Frankenstein or a modern adaptation of Frankenstein than specifically, this person is playing God. Because I think that that's a theme that we as modern audiences have seen done quite a bit and very few times done well. So I think these sort of new additions are very interesting. I do think that the writing itself falls too much into tropey and trite writing conventions, that those themes really don't get to shine through at all. They're really kind of side filler to this costume drama procedural horror thing. And I think that those themes should be the focus, and the plot being something that serves those themes and not the other way around. I also think Flora's murder is really cruel in a way that doesn't feel earned by the narrative. She's a character that her entire narrative is only a driving force for the men around her, and then she's just killed as yet another driving force for Marlett. It really felt like, okay, we've done all we can think to do with Flora. Like, she's no longer beneficial to the narrative. Get her out of here and get, this is why Marlett is going to be executed all out in one fell swoop. So I just didn't think that was earned justice for Flora, in my opinion. Having seen trailers, I know that Nightingale is still a character. I really hope that they give him more. He is interesting on paper. In execution, he's given very little. So I do hope that he is given some more. I also feel that way about Miss Harvey, because her one line in the last episode, I think, was really interesting. Whereas every other monologue she has in the rest of the series is kind of just, this is thematic exposition, and that's it. So I have some hope. Okay, let me rephrase that. I don't have hope. I have some desires for season 2. I don't know if we're going to get them, but that is what I'm hoping for. In the next 2 months, there will be 2 more episode breakdowns like the last one and this one that are purely plot synopsis. And then once we have gone over all 12 episodes of the show, I will sit down and do a full analysis of, my views and the narrative structure of the show. If there are any specific questions about the show that you would like included or answered in that final analysis, you can DM me on Instagram or Twitter. Instagram is Das Beast Performance and Twitter is Cryptid Cabaret. This episode was written by me, Sophie Marie, and edited by Otto Schatz. Bodybuilding with Victor Frankenstein is distributed by Buzzsprout.com and is available on Spotify and everywhere that you find podcasts. Also, this show and all of my creative projects would not be able to happen without my Patreon supporters. The $15 and up category is filled with some great people. They are Carrie Morrison, Joella Oldfield, Mike Nevin, Jamari Littlejohn, and Lois Gallagher. Thank you all so much, and I'll see you next time.